Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry for the earthquake. Apparently, I can't always control my dark powers. My name is Michael Verzatoulis. I am a doctoral researcher at the philosophy department of the University of Vienna. And my field is metaphysical epistemology. And in this context, I study a plenitude of mythological, religious, and magical texts, mainly from antiquity. As you might have guessed, I also dabble in the occult myself. So this isn't really a costume as much as in some circles it's considered my work clothes. And so you might say I'm a LARPer in real life. And I think that my varied interests place me at an interdisciplinary crossroads that I would like to think makes me well suited to talk to you about role-playing a mage. And specifically about certain basic archetypal psychological aspects of playing a mage. Because playing a mage is not just about using spells rather than swords. Just like when you play a vampire, you can't just snap on a couple of fake fangs, pretend to be burned by sunlight and call it a day or a night. In the same way, playing a mage has its deeper aspects that you should keep in mind if you want to embody the role. So we're going to go into certain, let's say, archetypal structures from folklore, from tales, from local tradition that I think we can all recognize, even if we can't really remember from which story, or in which story we have encountered them. So I think they're archetypal at that level. So magic, depending on the setting, can take various forms. It can be just plain knowledge, it can be an innate ability or talent, it can be a gift of the gods. That doesn't really matter here. There's something deeper about it that's common. Magic is the ability to tap into raw potential and manifest structures that others would not be able to. So magic, the practice of magic, the ability to tap into that raw potential, by default places the practitioner in a distinct category, both socially and ontologically. Ontologically, because sometimes the mage can be seen as a hubristic parasite that leeches the power of God. But that's probably a discussion for another day, or maybe another convention. So we'll talk more about how magic as access to power that's unique to specific individuals places the practitioner in a distinct social category, and the psychological aspects of that. I'm going to go into it, and then we'll have some time for a bit of Q&A, a bit of a discussion. So yeah, keep your questions in mind, because I think we can have an interesting discussion afterwards. So, as I said, magic is the tapping into raw potential. This is essentially a form of power. A quite unique form of power, usually reserved for the gods in the mythical context, but in this case it is almost usurped by a mortal, by a creature that's not supposed to have this power. Society has not been built to accommodate this sort of individual. So this has a double effect. On the one hand, this power might make the mage attractive out of curiosity or out of just seeing him as on the top of a hierarchy just because of the power, but it also pushes people away out of fear of the danger, but mainly because of the innate fear of whatever is different. So we have, in this case, an individual that is powerful, that has power that is unique to them and maybe a few others, but not the main population. And this same individual is, in many ways, isolated and marginalized by the rest of society. This can be a recipe for disaster in many cases, and we have stories like that, but the thing is that no matter how much power the mage has, no matter what he can attain with it, there is always a residual resentment for their marginalization. The mage lives in a world that he desires, but that rejects. So, how does someone in this position cope with this resentment? How does a powerful individual cope with the rejection of a world they by default desire? Either by acceptance or non-acceptance. In the case of non-acceptance, we pretty much have two ways this can go. The first is the mage becomes a tyrant, essentially. Either just unleashing destruction as a form of revenge to alleviate the pain of the resentment, or by basically using his power to rule over those that reject him, the society that reject him. The other path is, of course, madness, and that can take many forms, but we will not go into that as much. Now the other path, the path of stoic acceptance of the situation. This leaves the mage in a state of stoic sorrow, but also the wisdom and the, let's say, the small comfort of, in the end, finding a functional role. And in this case, we have the archetype of the wizard in the tower. Or, the female equivalent of that would be the crone in the hut. We usually don't see a young witch in a hut. And I think this has to do with the fact that young women are fertile, therefore, by default, they have a place in society because, continuation of the species, etc., etc. But the old crone is infertile, so she can leave society and basically have a very similar role as the male wizard in the tower. Now the tower, I'm going to refer to the tower from now on, but the same goes to the hut. The wizard's tower is quite interesting because it is an artifact of civilization within the wilderness. So the wizard is cocooned by both this artificial structure of civilization and the wilderness of nature that surrounds it. The wizard's tower is outside the bounds of society, outside the bounds of the city, but it's not inaccessible. It's sometimes difficult to reach, but it's not inaccessible. We'll see the repeating archetypal story of people from the regular world going out into the wilderness, into the marginalized space, into the liminal space to meet the wizard, to meet the mage, for aid, for advice, for anything that normal society cannot provide, but a liminal individual can. There is, of course, the concept of this cocooning into the tower and into the wilderness. It has a form, it evokes a concept of protection, of course. And this protection is dual in its nature. Because on the one hand, it protects the wizard from a society that has marginalized him. It protects the mage from the human world that he's not really equipped to handle. On the other hand, the tower also protects society from the wizard. Because regardless of the mage's intentions, he is by default a font of chaos, whether they like it or not. So there is this dual protective nature of the layers of the tower and the wilderness. So it is in this aspect that we see, for example, the meeting with the mentor in the monomyth that we're all familiar with. It's big. You can see it in Russian fairy tales. The hero going out into the Russian wilderness to seek out Baba Yaga, and you can see it in Star Wars where Luke goes and finds Obi-Wan Kenobi in the desert. It's the same pattern of the monomyth. The liminal individual who is semi-outside of society, not inaccessible, but also somewhat hard to reach, and acts as the mentor to the hero. And because the hero needs to leave society, leave the bounds of the normal, the mage in his liminal and marginal state is an intermediary between the society that the hero leaves and the wilderness that awaits. So it's not just what the mage as the mentor can provide, it's also the state of this liminal bridge between worlds in many ways. Another form that this can take is the archetype of the mage as the royal advisor, basically Merlin to Arthur. We all know this archetype very well. It's quite interesting that although the mage might come from humble beginnings, the king is actually socio-ontologically closer to the common man than the mage. Because this here is not an issue of class, it's an issue of ontological categories, a sort of ontological class pyramid, if you will, which has its own variations. And so we all have the figure of Merlin in mind, of course. But if you would like a more historical example, we have the example of Dr. John Dee, who was Queen Elizabeth I's court wizard, essentially. He was actually a very interesting figure, and he actually founded England's first secret service. He was the first person to use the term British Empire, and he also inspired James Bond, strangely enough, because he signed his letters to Elizabeth as 007. That's just some fun facts that I always like to include in this case. But it's interesting that we have a historical figure that fits the mythological archetype so perfectly, because I think that is an indication that these structures are indeed very archetypal, very deeply ingrained in our thought. So now we have like a functional idea of what I'm talking about. The mage, he's socially and ontologically liminal and marginalized, rejected not just by society, not just by a world, but also to a degree by a universe in which he has a special position, but in which he's also a flawed cog in the machine in many ways. To role play a mage, it's very important to keep this in mind. To understand the burden of the desire of a world that rejects you. To know how it is to have your desired object either reject you or crack when you try to touch it, because you wield too much potential that is not meant for this world. It is a heavy burden that can either evolve the mage into the stoic sage or into the mad tyrant, and many variations of that in between. And of course, when there is such a heavy burden upon an archetypal individual that manifests in many ways, there will have to be some sort of a narrative of consolation that helps even the sorrow-laden stoic mage cope. But this starts even from the beginning, from the young mage that experiments and feels the rejection, but also feels the power. And this is the idea of looking toward something greater, something that the mage can reach, or something that the mage can build. And this is beautifully encapsulated in the Latin phrase per aspera ad astra, through hardship to the stars. Thank you. Open to questions.
One question. You say that the mage is marginalized by society. That is mirrored by the myths, where you're supposed to, like, it's mirroring real life. Merlin is mirroring the medieval Britain of 800s. Baba Yaga as well. But what if in a setting the mage isn't marginalized? Yeah, it's not the average Joe that becomes a mage, but you can find many mages among men. Like even your example with Star Wars. Yes, Jedi is not everyone, but at some point there were a lot. They weren't marginalized. In some fantasy setting like Warcraft, Pathfinder, all the fantasy settings. They are fewer than knights, raiders, and stuff, but they are still a lot. How do you embody someone who isn't that excluded?
That is the most important question to add to the end of my lecture. But before I answer it, I want to pinpoint some facts about the examples he brought, because it's not that they're incorrect, but they're incomplete. For example, in Star Wars, even during the times of the High Republic, you have a galaxy of trillions and you have about 100,000 Jedi. They're not that many. They have been incorporated as something useful within society.
They have their own towers.
Yes, but yes, they need to live as monks. You know? Yeah. And to a certain degree, this is like a combination between a monastery and the coven of witches. If you think about it. So there's still this sort of marginalization. And think about it, a Jedi's entire life is training so that he won't fall into the dark side. So he won't become the mad tyrant, essentially.
In my mind, marginalized has a negative connotation.
Well, yes. Even in Star Wars, the Jedi, they're incorporated by the Republic into its system, but they are feared by a lot of the citizens. They're not seen as heroic by everybody. You know, the same example with the Witchers, for example, in The Witcher. You know, like the pogroms of the Witcher and everything. But I think that one good example, a good example where mages are not marginalized, are the cases where we have a magocracy. For example, like the Tevinter Imperium and Dragon Age.
Yes. Dragon Age is its own.
Yeah, sure. But, how do things lead up to a magocracy? It's because the few marginalized individuals develop an ideology that might make right. And this ideology is very often built by the resentment that has been created by marginalization.
Dying for the
and the important thing to keep in mind is that even if the mage is not marginalized by society per se, he's always marginal in terms of the greater ontological scale of the universe. Yes. So this is a burden to carry as well. Yes. So I hope I covered it. Yes.
Okay. Part of the discussion was the marginalization and the apprentice. So I have two questions for the apprentice. In some of the movies, the stories, we see an original rejection of the apprentice. In your opinion, is that because of the potential of the power used wrong, or because the master doesn't want the apprentice to have the same fate as him? Like this marginalization and inspiration and so on.
It can take both of those forms and many more, but I think the archetypal core behind the initial rejection is essentially the test of the initiate. You know, it's the test that, will you come back after I reject you? Do you really want this? Have you really thought about it? You know, so we have a lot of traditions where it's necessary to say no like 1 or 3 times before saying yes. So of course these psychological elements come into play a lot, very often, but I think the archetypal idea behind them is the test of the initiative.
So, and the second part was why would you think it's necessary for the hero to not only have the mentor, but sometimes becoming the mage itself? What is does show us that in the end the hero will be also marginalized? What do you think is how does the archetype work there for hero, not the sage or something?
Well, the hero in his own right is also by default marginalized. He's not like everybody else. He takes the burden of doing something great. That might bring him maybe even worship in the end and the appreciation of society, but he still carries the burden of being in a marginal position. So the lines are not very clear. Like, obviously King Arthur doesn't have the same fate as Merlin, but he also carries a very heavy burden. So the lines are tricky there. It's a very good point.
I would ask that in a world where magic is understood in the margin that it can be understood, how does an adept feel? Again, there is going to be resentment because people can understand but not reach him. They're never going to be equals. But in a world where people know what he can do and understand how to approach a mage, and it's not a magical being of mythical power, but something that's within reach of comprehension, how does that change things?
Well, I think it changes the manifestation of the narrative, but I don't think it changes the archetypal structure behind it. Like, for example, okay, let's take like a very modern example. We all know how hacking works, okay? And when we have a friend who's a hacker, we know what he does. We understand the basic technology behind it. It's not really mysterious. But at the back of our minds, we're always afraid that he's going to hack into our account. So, yeah. So, individuals that have extra potential will always be viewed with some aspect of negative emotion from the general public, I think.
Yeah, I can agree.
So yeah.
Okay, in relation to the last thing, the three things that were said, I think the word marginalization might confuse a bit people. Like, it makes the mage separate from society, and that it makes him unapproachable. Even if he's, even if he's in a society that treats him with respect or even reverence, you are still the hero. That, oh no, don't go talk to the hero. He has more important things to do, and he is alone at the table in the banquet. And nobody will approach him because no, don't go. Something might happen. But there is one thing. I think this doesn't apply to the Western idea of the mage, but you can see it mostly in Polynesia and some of the Eastern mythologies. That the embodiment of magic and the capability of changing the world and being ontologically different from everybody else. Immediately gives you the status of being the leader of men, and this is interchangeable in that when you become the leader of men, you attain magical status. This, of course, doesn't fit with the paradigm that we have been discussing here. I wasn't here from the beginning. I'm guessing that you focused on the Western side of things, and even to
sure, but even what you mentioned is a form of marginalization. Like, even if a leader of men is elevated to hero worship, that makes him separate in many ways.
True.
It gives him a different ontological status. It might be mainly positive, but marginalization takes a lot of forms. So,
and on the last part, I was about to mention that in modern society, the most easy thing to see, we're talking about the same archetype is. Scientists that are like physicists and they're working with the particle accelerators and computer guys that are working, in the dark and scary labyrinthian, workplaces in the basement, and they do something that you really need in general because everybody needs computers and programming to operate in society, but you don't really understand like the very basic stuff that they do in the daily basis unless you're one of them. There is at least a separation.
That's a very good example because I think it does show how archetypes emerge in all situations. And I think there's a favorite quote of mine by Jonathan Pajot that says, symbolism happens, and I think that's the best way to put it. So I think you had a question.
Yeah.
Then
No?
sure. Okay. So we see classic heroes and like ancient Greece, as what I mentioned, to actually revering the power. So my question is, how much, in your opinion, maybe the newer Western stories are a bit more about fetishizing the idea of someone having the power, but also suffering in it?
Sure, I think there's an aspect of that, but even if we were to see this as a more specifically Western fetishization, as you mentioned, I think that the archetype goes much deeper. Like, you know, the most known archetype we have of someone with extra power who suffers is Christ, for example. So I think this is very central. But now that you mentioned this emphasis in the Western world on that story, I think that the Christ archetype and the martyrs and the saints archetypes might be an inspiration on that as well, or at least an archetypal basis. So yeah, that's actually a good point.
Since we're in Greece and our tradition of magic in Greece was usually the Elysian mysteries.
Well, not exactly.
Eleusinian mysteries.
The Eleusinian mysteries were not magic. But they had a lot of connections and a lot of similarities with magical initiations, but you can't call them magic. The Mysterion, that's a category by itself of religious, of a sort of religious ritual, but they're not exactly magic.
What I wanted to ask is how secrecy comes into play. Because we see that mages are kind of incomprehensible. You don't understand most of what they do. You don't understand their ways, and mostly what they're trying to do, they do it in the dark. You can't understand magic, you can't find many books, you can't know everything about it. So how does someone who is rejected by the world that he so wants to be part of, how come he's secretive about it? How come he's not oversharing? How come he's not telling the world I am here?
Well, there are various aspects to why we have in the magical tradition the law of silence, the secrecy, as you say. The most superficial of it is avoiding persecution, obviously. The second is the idea of, and that goes into the mysteries as well, of keeping the sacred hidden. So that's a very deep archetypal idea that, you know, to go into the deeper mysteries you must be initiated, it's not for everyone. But I think there's also a third main aspect of that we don't talk about that much, and I think in his own way Lovecraft touched on it, that ontological knowledge can be an info hazard. It can actually break your mind. So, you know, it's, as I said, the tower also protects other people from the wizard, you know, and in this way the secrecy protects the coven from persecution, but it also protects the public from knowledge that it might not be able to handle.
As to continue this question, sorry, I'll just take 1 minute. So how you take this and you incorporate it in a LARP, that when other people than the mates need to understand the words or anything else as a gamified way, but how you capture this essence in a way that it makes sense aesthetically, but at the same time others can understand what the fuck is going on.
That's very good. That's very good. So specifically, which part of that do you mean? Like the secrecy, the info hazard part, which?
Just take one example and we can.
Okay.
It's okay.
So the first layers of the secrecy will depend a lot on the setting, of course. Okay. So if it's a setting where magic is like super illegal and persecuted, you know, you need to incorporate the feeling of fear of being found out, obviously. So there are a lot of variations on that. Now it's more difficult to embody the idea of having knowledge that is an info hazard. And my advice on that would be try pondering the concept of not being, go almost mad, and then play the role. That's the best thing I can tell you.
Okay.
This is not such a large question, but more than a role-playing game question. I have played Mage the Ascension, if you know it.
Sure.
One of the things in Mage is, for people who don't know it, is that magic exists, but the average Joe doesn't know about it. It's in the myths, it's in the books, it's in the comic books. But there's a secret society underground. People are sick. There are different paths to magic.
Sure.
Technology is magic, traditional magic, the gods.
Yeah.
How does a new awakened mage feels that people won't prosecute him because magic is real, like it's stuff of legend, but there is a secret society to it that welcome to a new family or not? How does a mage feel like that he is not excluded but born to a new world?
I would say that's very good. I would say that the feeling of being welcomed into this new world, I think, will depend a lot, and we see that archetypally a lot, will depend a lot on the feeling that the mage, prior to his awakening, always carried with him that somehow he doesn't belong, that something isn't right. So I think there's this archetypal idea that even if you're not awakened into the mysteries, you carry this ineffable knowledge of something not being quite right, not being quite normal. So I think that's where I would focus on that. Anybody else? Any thoughts?
Well, I have another thing. Sometimes, depending on the setting, you have basically a different version of the initiation. In that the knowledge, for example, of the initial stages of magic is pretty common and available, but a lot of time and investment needs to be put in for years and years and years to even reach the first level that actual mages will even talk to you and care about what you have learned so far, to consider you an initiate. So sometimes we say that the initiation is in the center of civilization. It's not in the town, it's not in the forest, it's in the city itself, and that's how it ties into the thing that I said before, and you said about magocracy and all that. We see sometimes that even benevolent mages, not only tyrants, basically you replace the forest around the tower with a magical town that might, of course, not have mages in it, but those people that are there serve the same function. Crossing the gates to this town is like crossing the forest. The town protects the rest of the world from the mage, and protects the mage from the rest of the world. So it's not only nature; it can also be civilization. I mean, do you agree?
Yeah, sure. And in that case, I would consider that a magical society is marginalized by non-magical society. So, anybody else? Any thoughts?
So we see in Shattered Earth and in the Shattered Earth, and both in the Legend of Merlin, that both mages are part of a world dying. So in Shattered Earth, magic is dying. In the Legend of Merlin, the Fae and those kind of creatures get extinct. How does this play in the aspects of a mage when he needs to be between worlds and he sees a part of his world to be destroyed or eliminated?
Well, it essentially maximizes the feeling of marginalization. So he already didn't belong in the way that, people recognized his existence, accepted it as a fact of being, but pushed him to the side by default. And now you have a context where the very narrative that allows him to have some kind of function in being collapses. So that's actually very good, and it actually goes into something that I like to study a lot, which is how essentially the Enlightenment destroyed the mythical epistemology that was innate to us. So that's a huge can of worms, but excellent point.
So on this point, I mean, this is of course the side of the archetypical explanation. But in the real world, all the stories and the archetype of the mage as somebody who is embodying a very powerful force that is fading and dying, is of course because of reality. Because in reality we don't have magic, so anybody who wanted to craft a story about a mage and wanted to elicit the suspension of disbelief by whoever was on the other side needed to, you know, somehow explain why there aren't these grand mages around to change the world as the stories say. Okay, it was in the past, and in the past there was more magic. Now we don't have that much magic, and I think this is the actual reason. I mean that this trope is emerging. So it's not. I don't think it ties to the rest of the the reasons for the archetype emerging. It's a separate thing because it needs to be supported on this for the idea to even exist in reality, you know, for people to share it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, that's not necessarily directly, saying something on what you said, but I think it's very interesting. The idea, the very curious semantics of the phrase magic isn't real. What do we mean by that? Like, anthropologically, magic is a practice that exists. It is. You can see it. You can catalog it. It exists as an anthropological phenomenon for millennia, basically, for as long as we have centuries, essentially. The question magic is or is not real essentially considers, does it have an ontological effect or not? And that, of course, is a huge issue, which we can't really open here. But there is something more interesting, I think, that more down to earth that we could keep in mind. That magical practice, and I mean in the real world, anthropologically speaking, regardless of whether it has an ontological effect or not, it most certainly has a psychological effect on the practitioner, and so. That by itself, can be a cause for marginalization and self-marginalization. So, it's a good point.
So you said before that you see elements of the story of the Christ to some of the mages. So at the end, as we know, there is the resurrection, so there is a resolution. Number one, do you think there are such resolutions in the stories of other mages? And number two, do we really want that for a LARP or for a game, or do we just want to see the suffering stage of a character or of a player?
That's very good, and I think that essentially for the mage, there is no real resolution. For the mystic, there is. It's a form of ascension that puts his consciousness into a different plane, and he's happy just being there. The mage is never happy just reaching a stage. The idea of peraspera and astra, 300 to the stars, is constant. The mage can stare into the eye of God and not be satisfied. That's part of the hubristic part of his archetype, and it's a very big part of him. So I think that it's a very good point, and I think somebody who plays a mage to a certain degree needs to incorporate a sense of knowing that he will never be satisfied.
One last question and we wrap it up.
Yes. Okay, for the LARP part of we have the maids. Okay, you say that the maids have to get close to a tower and be there and do his stuff. It's simple. Okay, but for the LARP, it's very crucial to have communication, interaction with the people around. This is the basic, most of the time this is the basic part of the LARP. So if you have a fantasy LARP game that magic exists, whatever it is, it's more futuristic or more medieval, okay, how can you balance to be a mage with the right archetype, but still continue to be part of the game, of the LARP game as an whole?
Sure. Well, that depends on whether you're a player or an NPC. If you're an NPC, you can pretty much embody any role that's required. If you're a player, I think that the necessary part that you'll have to embody in your story is the part of the moment that is the call to adventure. There is something that needs to push you, outside of your comfort zone and into interaction, and probably also into society. So you probably have to write that into your backstory. Why you're not in your class.
Even that, it's they call it have to see the eye of God. Even the call to adventure
might
not right now, but you have to see
trying
something
to see
else.
the eye of God. You can do that basically. One way is sitting in your tower, reading and performing rituals.
But it's acceptable for the mates to pass in the human society of the players that are not mages. They play common things like a fighter or a traveler or a musician. It's okay for them because they can still continue to be mages without corrupt the basic archetype of what they really are.
Well, that will depend on many things. It will depend on the setting, and it mainly will depend on the character you play. You can play
the basic what a mage is.
That's the thing. The mage is not one archetype.
Okay.
There's so many sub-archetypes. You can be the calm sage who just wants to share wisdom. You can be the young ambitious mage who wants to try and climb the social ladder. So, and it basically depends on what your character is.
Okay. Thank you.
So, thank you everyone.
Thank you very much.
Secondo lo fai, no?
Piuttosto,
No,